Hello, everybody. Today is Friday, January the 8th, and this is the 28th edition of Book Fun Friday. Welcome and Happy New Year. I want to especially thank today my friend Marlon, who recommended the book that I'm going to talk to you all about today. And that book is titled The Patron Saint of Nothing, and it's written by the author Randy Rebay. So the protagonist of this novel is a young man named Jay, and Jay is Filipino-American. And I mention Filipino-American for this reason. Jay was born in the Philippines, but when he was 1, he and his family moved back to the U.S. His mom is actually American, and they moved back to the United States. And so from the time that he was 1 until the time when the novel starts, when he's 17, he's a senior in high school, he has lived all of his life, except for that first year, in the U.S. They do go on a family vacation when he's 10 back to the Philippines to visit aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. But really for Jay, this is not something that is hugely connected to him as a person. He doesn't speak any of the languages of his family. He doesn't really understand the culture of his family. He doesn't really understand the foods or the customs of his family who live in the Philippines. He's very much an American teenager, except the one connection that he keeps to the Philippines is his cousin, June. Now, he and June are almost the exact same age. Jay is literally 3 days older than his cousin. And so they're basically the same age, but they live in these different worlds. And what's really cool is when Jay goes back to visit his family when he's a young boy and realizes that he has this great friend in his cousin, June, who's the same age as he basically, they decide to stay in touch by writing literal pen and paper letters to one another. And so they do that for several years until Jay kind of gets to a point where that letter writing thing falls off for him. And even though June keeps writing letters to him, he doesn't necessarily keep writing back. And little by little by little, he loses contact with his cousin. And that's normal. He's become a senior in high school. He's gone, had a girlfriend. He's got a best friend named Seth. He's trying to figure out where he's going to go to college and what he wants to do with his life. All of those things get in the way of staying in touch with his cousin, June. Until he gets some really awful news. He hears from his father, very bluntly, actually, his father delivers this news that June has been shot and killed. Now, that is not a spoiler, y'all. That's literally on the dust jacket of the book. But it's a terrible shock to Jay to find out that this has happened to his cousin. And aside from the fact that it's shocking, he is overwhelmed with guilt that all these years have gone by and he had lost touch with his cousin, and now his cousin has been shot and killed. And an added layer to that, so he's grieving, he feels guilty about losing contact with him. An added layer to that is nobody in his family really seems all that upset about it. They're certainly not talking about it. His brother and sister, when he tries to discuss it with them, are sort of nonplussed about the situation. His mom and dad aren't giving him any details. And for whatever reason, Jay decides he has to find out why his cousin, this boy who was basically his best friend for many years, with whom he corresponded for a long time, was shot and killed in the street in the Philippines. And so he sets out to discover what happened to his cousin. He convinces his parents to let him travel there over spring break and visit aunts and uncles and cousins and his grandparents. And he has this idea that if he can go back to the Philippines, even though he doesn't necessarily have this connection to that country, he feels drawn to this country at this point, just so he can find out what happened to his cousin. I think we would probably call that closure, is what he is seeking. And then that's the story. That's the rest of the book. That's what he does. The story is he goes to the Philippines to discover, and he does discover the why, what happened to his cousin. So I'm going to read chapter 1 of this novel. Now, if you decide to pick up this book and read it, and I hope you do, chapter 1 is crucial. I think chapter 1 in a lot of books is crucial, but if you don't really get the text and the subtext of chapter 1 of this book, you're not going to have as deep or as rich a connection to the rest of the story. So that's the chapter that I'm going to share out loud right now. It was a day of soil, sunlight, and smoke. Curtains thin as bed sheets glowed gold as roosters called out from the backyard on the other side of the concrete walls and single-pane windows. On the floor of the room my father and his 2 brothers had shared growing up, my mom held me as I held a lifeless puppy. I cried. The oscillating fan hummed, blowing warm air on us every few seconds. I was 10, and it was my first time back in the country where I'd been born. A few days earlier, my family had driven the 11 hours along frightening roads from Manila to Lolo and Lola's, that's his grandfather and grandmother, Lolo and Lola's house in the Bicol region. When we arrived, we found that their dog, an unnamed mongrel chained to the cacao tree out back, had just given birth to a litter of puppies. Only one had lived. The mother refused to care for him, so I had taken the task upon myself. I held him close to keep him warm. I tried to feed him by dipping my finger into a bowl of evaporated milk and then offering a drop to the puppy's impossibly small mouth. However, the puppy would not drink the milk. Maybe because of the grief of losing his brothers and sisters, or maybe because of his mother's rejection, whatever the reason, his breathing grew shallow and his movements slowed. Each time he blinked, his eyes remained closed longer and longer until they never reopened. At that point in my life, I had only encountered death in fiction. I had heard about other people's relatives dying, but I had never seen death up close. I had never held it. Listen, Mom had said in that moment, hugging me closer, so I did listen. Baby birds chirped just outside the window. One thing dies, and another is born. Maybe the puppy's soul now has wings, she had said. Gradually, I calmed down and stopped crying, but I still felt heavy with sadness as the warmth left the tiny ball of brown and gray fur still cradled in my arms. When I finally stepped outside, almost all of my Filipino titas and titos, that's aunts and uncles, laughed. Not in a mean way, I think, but more like it was amusing that a dog's death affected me so much, because it was nothing to them. Another day, another dog. My cousins did not need to have someone stroke their hair and reassure them that death was part of life. It wasn't long before the family's attention drifted away like the smoke from the garbage being burned a few houses down. My brother and my sister resumed the card game of speed they'd been playing. My dad and Lolo returned their attention to their bottles of San Miguel. My mom gave my shoulder one last squeeze and then went over to the outdoor kitchen to help Tita Chato, Tita Ami, and Lola finish preparing lunch. Tito Danilo rested a hand on the top of my head and spoke of finding comfort in God's love. while Tito Maning told me to stop crying and took the puppy's limp little body away from me. He returned a few minutes later, brushing his palms as if he had just taken out the trash. He moved to pet the puppy's mother as he walked past, but she shied away. He continued on and took out a new bottle of beer from the cooler and sat down next to Dad and Lolo. Tito Danilo stood by in awkward silence for a few more moments before joining them, leaving me there alone. But I was not alone for long. My cousin, June, walked over and hugged me. I am sad too, Koya J, he had said, using the older brother designation, which never seemed right. I had been born only 3 days before him, and besides that, June was one of those people who moved through this world as if he had been around for a long time, an old soul, as they say. I almost asked June what his father had done with my puppy, what he had done with its brothers and sisters the previous day, but I didn't. We can only handle so much truth at any given moment, I suppose. So instead, I said nothing. He looked at me with sympathetic eyes, eyes so brown they were almost black. Do you want to go inside and read comics? He asked. I nodded, grateful for the chance to escape from everyone without being by myself. He threw his arm over my shoulders. We went inside. We read comics. A few days later, the vacation ended. I flew back to pine trees, overcast skies, and a Michigan winter that could sputter till May. My tan faded. My tongue forgot the taste of tocino and Tagalog. I stepped out of Tsinelas and back into my suburban life as if I had never left. And again, this book is titled The Patron Saints of Nothing, and it's written by Randy Rivet. Gosh, this book checks so many boxes, y'all. It touches on grief and loss. More expansively, it touches on xenophobia and homophobia and corrupt governments. There's learning how to navigate the world when you're not really comfortable in it, when you're afraid, when you're anxious, when you're nervous. So many things in this book that are instructive and really relatable. Well, guys, thank you as always for watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and healthy as always. And I'll be back next Friday for the 29th edition of Book Fun Friday. Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.